A 14-year-old boy who risked everything to save an elderly woman from a burning mansion thought his brave act would be forgotten. 2 days later, when a black limousine stopped in front of his small apartment, he had no idea his entire life was about to change forever. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Jaden Carter sat at his worn wooden desk, squinting at the math homework illuminated by a flickering desk lamp. The small bedroom felt stuffy in the late afternoon heat, but opening the window would let in the noise from the busy street below. His mother Regina's voice carried from the kitchen, where she was on the phone trying to negotiate another extension for their overdue electricity bill. "Yes, I understand, but I get paid next Friday," she said, her voice carrying that familiar strain of worry. "If you could just give us one more week." Jaden pressed his pencil harder against the paper, trying to focus on the algebra problems. His mother worked 2 jobs, mornings at the hospital cafeteria and evenings cleaning offices, but they still struggled to make ends meet. Their small 2-bedroom apartment in the east side of town wasn't much, but it was all they could afford since his father passed away 3 years ago. The sound of sirens wailed in the distance, a common occurrence in their neighborhood. Jaden glanced out his window, expecting to see the usual police cars speeding past. Instead, he noticed thick, dark smoke rising from somewhere behind the row of luxury homes that bordered their apartment complex. These houses belonged to a different world, a world of manicured lawns, security gates, and imported cars that Jaden only saw in magazines or on TV. The smoke grew thicker, and now he could see orange flames flickering above the tree line. Without thinking, Jaden grabbed his phone and rushed downstairs. His mother was still on the phone, pacing in their tiny kitchen. "Jaden, where are you going?" she called after him. "There's a fire nearby, Mom. I'm just going to check it out." Outside, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the cracked sidewalk. Other neighbors had gathered, pointing at the smoke. Jaden ran toward the luxury homes, his sneakers pounding against the pavement. As he got closer, he could see the fire was coming from one of the largest houses on the street, a 3-story brick mansion with white columns and perfectly trimmed hedges. Mr. Martinez, their neighbor who worked as a gardener for some of these wealthy homes, stood at the ornate iron gates, speaking rapidly into his phone. "Yes, fire department. 1255 Wellington Drive." "It's getting worse." Mrs. Park, an elderly Korean woman who lived in their apartment complex, grabbed Jaden's arm. "Stay back, boy, this is not our business. Let the rich people handle their own problems." But Jaden couldn't just stand there. The smoke was getting thicker and he could hear a faint sound. Was that someone calling for help? He pressed his face against the gates, trying to see better. Through the smoke, he caught a glimpse of movement behind one of the upper windows. "I think someone's trapped inside," he shouted. "The fire department is coming," Mr. Martinez said, putting his phone away. "They said 5 minutes. We should wait." But Jaden knew 5 minutes could be too long. He was small and quick. Years of basketball had kept him in shape despite their poor diet. Without hesitation, he began climbing the iron gate, ignoring Mrs. Park's protests. "Jaden Carter, get down from there," she yelled. "You're going to get yourself killed, or worse, they'll blame you for the fire." He understood her fear. In their neighborhood, a young black boy running into a wealthy person's property usually meant trouble. But someone needed help. And right now, that was all that mattered. Jaden dropped down on the other side of the gate, landing softly on the manicured lawn. The heat from the fire hit him like a wave, and the smoke made his eyes water. The front door was probably locked, but he spotted a garden trellis leading up to a second-floor window. This was crazy, he thought. His mother would kill him if she knew what he was about to do. But then he heard it again. A weak cry for help from somewhere inside the burning mansion. Jaden took a deep breath, said a quick prayer, and ran toward the trellis. Behind him, he could hear Mr. Martinez shouting for him to come back, and Mrs. Park's voice rising in panic. The next few minutes would change his life forever, though he didn't know it yet. As he began climbing the trellis, his heart pounding in his chest, he had no idea that somewhere in a corporate boardroom across town, Alexander Hughes was about to receive an urgent phone call about his mother's mansion being on fire. and neither of them could have guessed how their lives were about to become intertwined in ways that would shock everyone in both their worlds. The wooden trellis creaked under Jaden's weight as he climbed higher, the heat from the fire growing more intense with each movement. Sweat dripped down his face, and the smoke made his eyes burn. The pristine white paint of the mansion was now stained with black soot, and orange flames flickered behind several windows. Through the haze, he could make out more details of the massive house. It was easily 4 times the size of his entire apartment building, with ornate stonework and huge windows that reflected the late afternoon sun. Under different circumstances, he might have felt intimidated by such grandeur. But right now, all he could think about was reaching that second-floor window. The cries for help came again, weaker this time. Jaden moved faster, ignoring the splinters digging into his palms. Below, he could hear more voices joining Mr. Martinez and Mrs. Park. Someone shouted about the fire trucks being stuck in traffic. Another voice warned about the danger of the gas lines. A woman screamed that he was just a boy, that he should come down immediately. Jaden reached the second-floor window and found it locked. The glass was hot to the touch, and through it, he could see thick smoke swirling inside. He looked down. The drop was at least 20 feet. For a moment, doubt crept in. What was he doing here? He was just a kid from the east side, the son of a cafeteria worker. He had no training, no equipment, no right to be climbing up this wealthy person's house. Then he heard something that made his decision clear. A weak voice, closer now, calling, "Help. Please. Anyone." Jaden looked around frantically and spotted a large decorative planter on the window ledge. Without hesitation, he grabbed it and swung it against the window. The crash seemed deafening, and for a moment he worried about getting in trouble for destruction of property. The irony of that thought, worrying about breaking a window while trying to save someone from a fire, almost made him laugh. The window shattered, sending glass shards everywhere. Jaden used his sleeve to clear the remaining pieces from the frame, cutting his arm in several places. The smoke billowed out, making him cough violently. He could hear sirens in the distance now, but they still sounded too far away. "Hello?" he called into the smoke-filled room. "I'm here to help. Where are you?" He pulled himself through the window, landing on what felt like plush carpet. The heat was overwhelming, and the smoke made it nearly impossible to see. He dropped to his hands and knees, remembering something from a school assembly about staying low in a fire. The room was massive, probably bigger than his entire apartment. Through the smoke, he could make out expensive-looking furniture, paintings on the walls, and what looked like a crystal chandelier. Everything seemed to shimmer in the heat, creating an almost dreamlike effect. "Help." The voice came from somewhere to his left. Jaden crawled in that direction, his eyes stinging. He found a doorway and entered what appeared to be a hallway. The smoke was even thicker here, and he could hear the ominous sound of crackling flames from somewhere nearby. "Keep talking, Rigaud," he called out. "I'm coming." A weak cough responded, closer now. Jaden moved faster, ignoring the burning in his lungs. He reached another door and pushed it open. The handle was hot, and he pulled his sleeve over his hand to turn it. Inside, he found what looked like a study or library. Books lined the walls, and expensive leather furniture was arranged around an ornate fireplace. On the floor near a large desk lay an elderly woman in an elegant dress, now covered in soot. She was conscious but clearly struggling to breathe. "I'm here to help," Jaden said, crawling to her side. "Can you move?" Mrs. Victoria Hughes looked up at him with glassy eyes. Her white hair was disheveled, and her face was streaked with soot. "My legs," she whispered. "I fell. Can't get up." Jaden heard a loud crash from somewhere in the house. The fire was spreading fast. He needed to get them both out quickly. But how could he carry an adult woman? He was only 14, and though he was tall for his age, he wasn't very strong. "I'm going to help you up," he said, trying to sound more confident than he felt. "We need to go now." He positioned himself beside her and wrapped his arms around her shoulders. She was lighter than he expected, but still much heavier than anything he'd tried to lift before. With a grunt of effort, he managed to get her into a sitting position. "The stairs," she said weakly. "Too far. Can't make it." "We're not using the stairs," Jaden replied. "We came in through the window, and that's how we're getting out, but I need you to help me. Can you hold onto my neck?" She nodded faintly and wrapped her arms around his neck as he attempted to lift her. His muscles screamed in protest, but adrenaline gave him strength he didn't know he had. Somehow, he got to his feet, carrying Mrs. Hughes in an awkward but functional hold. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The smoke was getting worse, and he could feel the heat intensifying. The fire was close now, perhaps in the next room. Jaden stumbled toward the door, his legs shaking with effort. Mrs. Hughes coughed weakly against his shoulder, her grip starting to loosen. "Stay with me," he said through gritted teeth. "We're almost there. Just hold on tight." Jaden staggered through the smoke-filled hallway, carrying Mrs. Hughes toward the broken window. His lungs burned, and his muscles trembled with exhaustion. The heat pressed against them from all sides, making each step a struggle. Behind them, he could hear the crackle of flames growing louder, accompanied by the ominous sound of splintering wood. "Almost there," he wheezed, though he wasn't sure if Mrs. Hughes could hear him. Her grip around his neck had weakened and her breathing was shallow. He tried not to think about how much smoke they had both inhaled. Outside, the voices had grown more numerous. He could hear the distinct sound of fire engines arriving, their sirens piercing through the roar of the flames. Someone was shouting through a megaphone, but the words were muffled by the thick walls of the mansion. When they reached the room with the broken window, Jaden's heart sank. The smoke had thickened considerably, and now he could see actual flames licking at the doorframe behind them. The plush carpet beneath his feet felt hot, and he knew they didn't have much time. "Mrs. Hughes," he said, giving her a gentle shake. "I need you to hold on tight. We're going to have to get creative here." She stirred slightly, managing a weak nod against his shoulder. Jaden approached the broken window, careful to avoid the remaining shards of glass. The trellis that had been his way up now looked impossibly fragile. There was no way it would support both their weight. Looking down, he saw that firefighters had arrived and were setting up below. Several of them spotted him and began shouting and pointing. One raised the megaphone. "Stay where you are. We're bringing up a ladder." But Jaden could feel the heat intensifying behind them. The floor beneath his feet was growing hotter, and he didn't think they had time to wait. Then he noticed something. A small balcony about 15 feet to their left. If he could somehow reach it. "Mrs. Hughes," he said urgently, "there's a balcony nearby. I'm going to try something. Please just hold on as tight as you can." He shifted her weight, ensuring her arms were secure around his neck. Then, staying as low as possible to avoid the worst of the smoke, he began inching along the wall toward the balcony. The ledge outside the window was narrow, barely wide enough for his feet. One wrong step would send them both plummeting to the ground. The fire roared behind them, and Jaden could hear windows shattering somewhere in the house. His heart pounded so hard he thought it might burst. He tried not to look down, focusing instead on each careful step. Mrs. Hughes remained silent, but he could feel her trembling. Halfway to the balcony, a blast of hot air nearly knocked them off balance. Jaden pressed against the wall, his fingers finding purchase in the ornate stonework. His shoes slipped slightly on the ledge, sending a few pebbles falling to the ground below. He heard gasps from the crowd. "Just a little further," he whispered, more to himself than to Mrs. Hughes. His arms were shaking from the effort of holding her, and his lungs felt like that they were filled with broken glass, but he kept moving, one agonizing step at a time. When they finally reached the balcony, Jaden almost cried with relief. He managed to maneuver them over the railing, collapsing onto the stone floor. The air was clearer here, and he gulped it gratefully. Mrs. Hughes stirred, coughing weakly. Below, firefighters were already positioning a ladder toward their location. Jaden could see a large crowd had gathered. Residents from both the wealthy neighborhood and his apartment complex, all watching with bated breath. He spotted his mother's face in the crowd, her hands clasped over her mouth in horror. "It's okay, Mom," he tried to call down, but his voice came out as a rasp. The smoke had done more damage than he realized. 2 firefighters scaled the ladder quickly, reaching the balcony. One immediately began checking Mrs. Hughes's vital signs while the other helped Jaden to his feet. "That was either the bravest or the craziest thing I've ever seen, kid," the firefighter said, his voice gruff but kind. "Let's get you both down from here." They secured Mrs. Hughes to a rescue harness first, carefully lowering her to waiting paramedics below. Jaden watched as they immediately placed an oxygen mask over her face and rushed her toward an ambulance. Then it was his turn to descend the ladder, his legs shaking so badly he could barely climb down. The moment his feet touched the ground, his mother engulfed him in a fierce embrace. "Don't you ever do anything like that again," she sobbed, holding him tight. "You could have died." Jaden wanted to respond, to tell her he was okay, but his throat felt like sandpaper. The world began to spin slightly, and he realized just how exhausted he was. Paramedics guided him to another ambulance, fitting him with an oxygen mask of his own. As they checked his vitals and treated the cuts on his arms, Jaden watched the firefighters battle the blaze. The mansion's upper floor was now fully engulfed in flames, exactly where he and Mrs. Hughes had been just minutes before. The reality of what he'd done began to sink in, and he felt a mix of terror and disbelief. Mr. Martinez appeared beside the ambulance, shaking his head in amazement. "You've got guts, kid," he said softly. "Real guts. But Mrs. Park is right. In this neighborhood, they're going to have questions about why you were there." Jaden nodded, understanding the implication. In their part of town, heroism didn't always protect you from suspicion. But as he watched Mrs. Hughes being treated in the other ambulance, he knew he'd made the right choice. Whatever came next, he could face it knowing he'd done what needed to be done. In the emergency room, Jaden sat on the edge of a hospital bed while a doctor examined his throat and lungs. The white walls and sterile smell were familiar. He'd spent enough time here visiting his mother during her shifts at the cafeteria. Now he was the patient, breathing through an oxygen mask while nurses bustled around him. Regina Carter stood nearby, alternating between proud smiles and worried frowns. She'd already called off her evening cleaning job, something they couldn't really afford but couldn't avoid. The doctor had insisted Jaden needed observation for smoke inhalation. "Your throat will be sore for a few days," the doctor said, removing his stethoscope. "And those cuts on your arms will need time to heal. But considering what you did, you're lucky to have gotten away with such minor injuries." Jaden nodded, wincing at the pain in his throat. Every breath felt like swallowing sandpaper. A nurse came by to change the bandages on his arms where the glass had cut him. His mother watched the procedure with concern, her hands clutching her worn purse. "How are we going to pay for this?" she whispered, more to herself than anyone else. They had no health insurance. Regina's part-time jobs didn't provide benefits, and they could barely afford rent, let alone medical coverage. The doctor pretended not to hear, focusing instead on writing in Jaden's chart. But Jaden saw the sympathy in his eyes. It was a look he'd grown familiar with, the one adults gave when they wanted to help but couldn't. In the bed next to him, separated by a thin curtain, he could hear people talking about Mrs. Hughes. She was stable but would need to stay overnight for observation. There were mentions of her son being notified and on his way. Jaden wondered what kind of person he was, this billionaire who owned one of the largest tech companies in the country. A police officer appeared at the door of his cubicle, notebook in hand. "Jaden Carter?" he asked, his expression neutral. "I need to ask you a few questions about what happened at the Hughes residence." Regina straightened up immediately, her posture tense. "My son is a hero," she said firmly. "He saved that woman's life." The officer nodded. "Yes, ma'am, we just need to understand exactly what occurred, standard procedure." He turned to Jaden. "Can you tell me what you were doing in that neighborhood?" Jaden removed his oxygen mask carefully. "I saw the smoke from my window," he said, his voice hoarse. "I live in the apartments nearby. I heard someone calling for help." "And how did you enter the property?" "I climbed the gate. I know I shouldn't have, but there wasn't time to wait." The officer made notes, his pen scratching against paper. Several witnesses confirmed your account. They saw you climb up and break the window. He paused. That was very brave, but also very dangerous. You could have been seriously hurt. Is Mrs. Hughes okay? Jaden asked. The officer's expression softened slightly. She's doing well, thanks to you. The fire department said another few minutes and... He let the sentence hang unfinished. More questions followed. About the fire, about how he found Mrs. Hughes, about what he saw inside the house. Jaden answered truthfully, though talking was painful. His mother stood guard the whole time, ready to intervene if the questions became too accusatory. Finally, the officer closed his notebook. Thank you for your cooperation. The fire department will want to speak with you too, but that can wait until you're feeling better. As the officer left, Jaden caught fragments of conversation from the hallway. The fire had started in the kitchen, something about an electrical fault. The mansion's smoke detectors had malfunctioned, failing to alert Mrs. Hughes until the flames had already blocked her escape route. She had been alone in the house except for the housekeeper, who had left early for a family emergency. A social worker appeared next, speaking quietly with Regina about payment plans and financial assistance programs. Jaden pretended not to listen, but he could see the worry lines deepening on his mother's face. Even with help, the hospital bill would be a burden they couldn't afford. Hours passed. The emergency room grew quieter as the day shift ended and night staff took over. Jaden dozed fitfully, the oxygen mask fogging with each breath. His mother sat in an uncomfortable chair beside him, checking her phone occasionally for messages from her employers. Through his haze of exhaustion, Jaden heard increasing activity in the hallway. New voices, expensive shoes clicking on linoleum, hushed conversations. He caught glimpses through the partially open curtain, men in suits, hospital administrators, someone important arriving. Then he heard a voice, clear and authoritative. "Where is the boy who saved my mother?" Alexander Hughes strode through the emergency room corridor, his presence commanding attention. He was tall and distinguished, wearing a perfectly tailored charcoal suit that probably cost more than Regina's yearly salary. His son Lucas walked beside him, a teenager about Jaden's age dressed in designer clothes, looking uncomfortable amid the hospital chaos. The hospital administrator hurried alongside them, speaking rapidly about Mrs. Hughes's condition. "She's stable, Mr. Hughes. The doctors want to keep her overnight for observation, but she's expected to make a full recovery thanks to the quick action of..." "The boy," Alexander interrupted. "Where is he?" Regina stood up as they approached Jaden's cubicle, instinctively moving closer to her son. Alexander Hughes entered, his sharp eyes taking in the scene. The oxygen mask, the bandaged arms, the worn clothes, and tired faces of the mother and son. "Jaden Carter?" His voice was softer now, almost gentle. "I'm Alexander Hughes. You saved my mother's life today." Jaden tried to sit up straighter, suddenly conscious of his hospital gown and messy appearance. He removed the oxygen mask carefully. "Yes, sir. How is she?" "Thanks to you, she'll be fine." Alexander moved closer, studying Jaden with intense interest. "The fire department told me what you did. Climbing that trellis, breaking the window, carrying her to safety." He shook his head in amazement. Most grown men wouldn't have attempted such a thing. Lucas hung back near the curtain, staring at Jaden with a mixture of awe and curiosity. He was clearly trying to reconcile the hero from the story with the ordinary-looking black kid in the hospital bed. Alexander turned to Regina. "Mrs. Carter, I understand you work 2 jobs to support your son?" Regina lifted her chin slightly. "Yes, sir. We manage. And no health insurance, I'm told." He glanced at the medical charts hanging nearby. "We make do," Regina said carefully, her pride evident in her voice. Alexander nodded, then reached into his suit jacket and pulled out a leather folder. "I've already spoken with the hospital administration. All of Jaden's medical expenses will be covered. Past, present, and future." Regina's eyes widened. "Mr. Hughes, that's very generous, but It's not generosity, Mrs. Carter. It's the least I can do. He opened the folder, revealing documents. But that's just the beginning. I understand Jaden attends East Side Public High School? Jaden nodded, his throat still too sore for easy speech. Not anymore. Alexander handed Regina a brochure for Westbrook Academy, the most prestigious private school in the city. He'll be transferring to Westbrook, where Lucas attends, full scholarship through graduation, including books, uniforms, and any extracurricular activities he wishes to pursue. Lucas stepped forward finally, finding his voice. That's my school. We've got the best basketball team in the state, if you're interested. Jaden's eyes lit up. Basketball was his passion, though his old school barely had a functioning team. But reality quickly dampened his excitement. Sir, Westbrook is across town. We don't have a car, and the bus doesn't. Transportation will be provided, Alexander cut in smoothly. And Mrs. Carter, regarding your employment situation. He pulled out more papers. I understand you worked in accounting before your husband passed away. Regina nodded slowly. Yes, but that was years ago. I couldn't find similar work after. There's an opening in my company's financial department, full benefits, including comprehensive health insurance. The salary is. He named a figure that made Regina grab the edge of Jaden's bed for support. Mr. Hughes, she began, her voice trembling slightly. This is too much. We can't. Mrs. Carter, Alexander interrupted gently. Your son risked his life to save my mother. Money means nothing compared to that. But beyond any sense of obligation, I've learned to recognize potential. Jaden showed extraordinary courage, quick thinking, and selflessness. Those qualities are rare and valuable. I'm not just offering charity. I'm investing in his future and yours. He turned back to Jaden. The world has a way of overlooking extraordinary people simply because of where they come from or what they look like. I'm in a position to change that, at least in this case. Will you let me? Jaden looked at his mother, seeing the tears in her eyes. Then at Lucas, who was now smiling encouragingly. Finally, at Alexander Hughes, whose expression held something Jaden hadn't expected. Respect. Yes, sir, Jaden said softly. Thank you. Alexander nodded, satisfied. Good. Now, when you're released tomorrow, a car will take you home. Get some rest. Monday morning, another car will pick you up for school. He glanced at Regina. And Mrs. Carter, shall we say 9 a.m. Monday at the office to handle the paperwork? As they left the cubicle, Jaden heard Lucas say quietly to his father, Maybe he can sit with us at lunch? Alexander's response was lost as they moved away, but Jaden saw him squeeze his son's shoulder approvingly. The hospital corridor gradually quieted, leaving Jaden and his mother alone with the life-changing documents spread across his bed. Regina picked up the Westbrook Academy brochure with trembling hands, then looked at her son. Jaden, she whispered, do you realize what just happened? He nodded, his own eyes filling with tears. One simple act of courage had just transformed their entire world. The next morning, Jaden woke up in his hospital bed to sunlight streaming through the window. His throat felt better, though still raw, and the cuts on his arms had begun to itch beneath the bandages. A nurse came in to check his vitals and told him he could be discharged after the doctor's final examination. His mother had gone home briefly to change clothes and grab a few things, leaving Jaden alone with his thoughts. The events of yesterday felt almost dreamlike. The fire, the rescue, and especially Alexander Hughes's visit. He picked up the Westbrook Academy brochure from his bedside table, studying the images of its sprawling campus and state-of-the-art facilities. A soft knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. To his surprise, Mrs. Victoria Hughes sat in a wheelchair pushed by a nurse. She looked much better than the last time he'd seen her. Her white hair was neatly combed, and her face, though tired, had regained its color. Good morning, Jaden, she said warmly. I hope I'm not disturbing you. No, ma'am, he replied, sitting up straighter. How are you feeling? Better, thanks to you. She gestured for the nurse to wheel her closer. "I wanted to see you before they discharged us both. I remember very little from yesterday, but I do remember your voice telling me to hold on tight." Jaden shifted uncomfortably under her gaze. Anyone would have done the same. Mrs. Hughes shook her head firmly. "No, they wouldn't have. I saw the security footage this morning. They recovered it from the mansion's cameras. Everyone else stood outside waiting for the fire department. But you—" She reached out and took his hand. "You climbed up that trellis without hesitation." Her hand was soft and cool against his. It struck him how different their lives had been until yesterday. She in her mansion with security cameras and expensive furniture. He in his small apartment watching the smoke rise. Yet here they were, connected by one moment of crisis. "I met your mother briefly last night," Mrs. Hughes continued. "She raised you well. Alexander told me about his plans for your education and her employment. I want you to know that I fully support his decision, but I'd like to add something of my own." She released his hand and reached into a small bag hanging from her wheelchair. "I understand you're interested in basketball?" Jaden nodded, wondering how she knew. "My late husband played professionally before he went into business. He always said sports teach valuable lessons about life: teamwork, discipline, perseverance." She pulled out an envelope. "The Hughes Foundation sponsors several youth basketball programs. I'd like you to attend their summer training camp. The best coaches in the country work with promising young players." Jaden's heart raced. He'd heard of these camps. They were famous for launching basketball careers, but they were incredibly expensive and selective. "But that's not all," Mrs. Hughes continued. "Alexander may be focused on your academic future, but I believe in nurturing all aspects of talent. I'm establishing a trust fund in your name." Jaden's mouth went dry. "A trust fund?" "Yes. To be used for college, of course, but also for any other educational or athletic pursuits you wish to follow. Your mother will help manage it until you turn 18. She smiled gently. "Consider it an investment in the young man who didn't stop to think about consequences when someone needed help." Before Jaden could respond, his mother returned, stopping short in the doorway when she saw Mrs. Hughes. Regina was wearing her cleanest outfit, her hair neatly braided, looking both tired and determined. "Mrs. Hughes," she said, stepping forward. "I didn't expect. How are you feeling?" "Much better, thanks to your remarkable son." Mrs. Hughes handed Regina the envelope. "I was just telling Jaden about some additional arrangements I'd like to make for his future." As his mother read the documents, her hands trembling slightly, Jaden watched both women. They came from such different worlds, yet there was a mutual respect in their interaction. His mother's pride and Mrs. Hughes's genuine gratitude created a bridge between their separate realities. "This is overwhelming," Regina finally said. "It's necessary," Mrs. Hughes replied firmly. "Your son showed extraordinary character. In my experience, such a character deserves nurturing." She turned back to Jaden. "The world will be watching you now, young man. Not because of where you came from or what you look like, but because of what you did. Show them what's possible when someone believes in you." A doctor appeared in the doorway, clipboard in hand, ready to begin discharge procedures. As the nurse wheeled Mrs. Hughes out, she paused one last time. "Oh, and Jaden? Once we're both fully recovered, I expect you to visit for dinner. My grandson Lucas is quite impressed with you, and I think you two might become good friends." Jaden nodded, his throat tight with emotion. In just 24 hours, his world had expanded beyond anything he could have imagined, all because he'd looked out his window at the right moment and decided to act. The day Jaden left the hospital felt like stepping into a new world. A sleek black car with tinted windows waited outside, the driver holding the door open with practiced courtesy. His mother sat beside him in the leather interior, both of them trying not to appear overwhelmed by the luxury. As they drove through the city, Jaden watched the neighborhoods change, from the sterile hospital district to the wealthy areas, then finally to their familiar east side. The car drew curious stares from neighbors as it pulled up to their apartment building. Mr. Martinez was watering the small patch of grass out front, and Mrs. Park stood on her balcony, both watching with undisguised interest. Inside their apartment, Jaden found his small room transformed. On his bed lay 3 crisp Westbrook Academy uniforms complete with blazers and ties. Next to them was a new laptop, a backpack filled with school supplies, and a top-of-the-line basketball in a presentation box. Lucas picked out the basketball, the driver explained, carrying in more bags. He said to tell you they practice every Tuesday and Thursday after school. Regina walked around the room, touching the uniforms with trembling fingers. The price tags had been removed, but Jaden knew each uniform probably cost more than she made in a week at the cafeteria. Her eyes lingered on the laptop, its sleek surface reflecting the afternoon light. "There's more in the car," the driver said. "Mr. Hughes insisted on a complete wardrobe, and Mrs. Hughes sent some books she thought you might enjoy." Jaden sat on his bed, running his hands over the uniform blazer. The Westbrook crest was emblazoned on the pocket, a shield with crossed quills and the motto, "Excellence through Opportunity" in Latin. Tomorrow he will wear this to his new school. "Mom," he said quietly, "are we dreaming?" Regina wiped her eyes, trying to maintain her composure. "No, baby, this is real. All because you were brave enough to do the right thing." The driver made several more trips to the car, bringing up boxes of clothes, shoes, and school materials. Each item was carefully chosen and of the highest quality. A new smartphone was nestled in one box, already programmed with important numbers, including the Hughes family's private contacts. As the driver prepared to leave, he handed Regina an envelope. "The car will be here at 7:30 tomorrow morning to take Jaden to school. Mr. Hughes also wanted me to remind you about your meeting at the office." After he left, their small apartment felt different. The new items seemed almost out of place against the worn furniture and faded walls. Yet they represented something more than mere possessions. They were tokens of a future neither of them had dared to imagine. Jaden spent the evening trying on his uniform, making sure everything fit perfectly. His mother helped him with the tie, her hands steady despite her emotional state. They hadn't had reason to tie a tie since his father's funeral. "Your father would be so proud," she said, smoothing the blazer's lapels. "He always said you were destined for great things." Later, as Jaden lay in bed, he could hear his mother on the phone with relatives, her voice thick with emotion as she described the events of the past 2 days. He stared at his ceiling, where the same water stain had marked the corner for years. Tomorrow, his view would be of Westbrook's vaulted halls and manicured grounds. His phone buzzed, a text from Lucas Hughes. "Can't wait to show you around tomorrow, don't worry. I've told everyone you're cool. Not many people can say they saved my grandmother from a fire." Jaden smiled, typing back a simple, "Thanks." He was nervous about tomorrow, about fitting in at a school where most students came from wealthy families. But Lucas's friendly message helped ease his anxiety. Another text came through, this one from Alexander Hughes. "Get some rest, Jaden. Tomorrow is the first day of your new journey. Remember, you earned this through your actions, not through chance or charity. You showed us who you are. Now show everyone else." Jaden read the message several times, letting the words sink in. From his window, he could still see the Hughes mansion in the distance, its upper floors now dark and fire-damaged. But it wasn't just the mansion that had transformed. His entire world had shifted on its axis, all because he'd chosen to climb that gate when others stood watching. He set his alarm, knowing tomorrow would bring challenges he'd never faced before. But he was ready. He had earned this opportunity, just as Mr. Hughes said. Now it was time to prove that courage wasn't just about running into burning buildings. Sometimes it was about facing a new life with determination and grace. Jaden's first day at Westbrook Academy started before dawn. He woke up an hour early, too nervous to sleep, and spent extra time making sure his uniform was perfect. The navy blazer fit like it was tailored specifically for him, and the crisp white shirt made him stand a little straighter. His mother was already up, making breakfast. Real breakfast, not just cereal. She'd bought eggs and bacon with some of the advance payment from her new job. The small kitchen smelled like home and new beginnings. "Eat," she said, placing a full plate in front of him. "You need your strength today." At exactly 7:30, the black car arrived. Several neighbors had gathered to watch, including Mrs. Park, who now beamed with pride despite her earlier warnings about getting involved with the wealthy. Mr. Martinez gave him a thumbs up from the garden he was tending. The drive to Westbrook took them through progressively more affluent neighborhoods until they reached the school's imposing gates. The campus sprawled across several acres with Gothic architecture and ivy-covered walls. Students in identical uniforms streamed through the entrance, many emerging from expensive cars or personal drivers. Lucas was waiting at the front steps wearing the same uniform but somehow making it look like he'd been born in it. "Jaden," he called out, jogging over. "You made it!" Other students turned to look, whispering among themselves. Jaden could hear fragments of their conversations. "That's him. The one from the fire. Hughes' grandmother." Lucas seemed oblivious to the attention, launching into a tour of the campus. "First period is physics, don't worry. I'll show you where everything is. The basketball coach wants to meet you during lunch break. Dad told him about your interest in the team." The halls of Westbrook were nothing like his old school. Polished wooden floors gleamed beneath their feet, and the walls were lined with oil paintings of distinguished alumni. Everything smelled of leather and old books. Their first class was in a laboratory that looked more advanced than anything Jaden had seen outside of movies. Each student had their own workstation with new equipment. The teacher, Dr. Hayes, welcomed him warmly, but didn't make a fuss, something Jaden appreciated. Throughout the morning, Lucas introduced him to other students. Most were friendly, if a bit reserved. A few seemed unsure how to act around him, but Lucas's easy acceptance set the tone. By lunchtime, Jaden had been invited to join several study groups and had 3 different offers to help him catch up on coursework. The cafeteria was more like a restaurant, with multiple food stations and healthy options. Lucas led him to a table where several other students sat, including some members of the basketball team. They made space without hesitation. "So," one of them asked, "is it true you carried Mrs. Hughes down from the 2nd floor?" Before Jaden could answer, another student chimed in. "My dad's in the fire department. He said you crossed a ledge while carrying her." "That's insane." Jaden shifted uncomfortably. "I just did what needed to be done." "That's what makes it cool," Lucas said, passing him a bottle of water. "You didn't think about it, you just acted. The coach is going to love that attitude." After lunch, they had a meeting with the basketball coach, Coach Richardson. The gym was state-of-the-art, with gleaming hardwood floors and professional-grade equipment. The coach, a tall man with graying hair and kind eyes, watched Jaden dribble and shoot for a few minutes. "Good form," he said approvingly. "You've got natural talent. With proper training, you could be exceptional. Practice starts next week. I expect you to be there." Throughout the afternoon classes, Jaden found himself both challenged and supported. The teachers moved at a faster pace than his old school, but they were also more engaged with their students. When he struggled with a calculus problem, the teacher spent extra time explaining it, and a classmate offered to tutor him if he needed help. By the end of the day, Jaden's head was spinning with new information, names, and possibilities. As he waited for his ride home, Lucas clapped him on the shoulder. "Not so bad, right?" Lucas grinned. "Oh, and don't forget, dinner at our house this weekend. Grandmother insisted the same black car picked him up, but now it felt less strange." On the drive home, Jaden reflected on how much had changed. He'd gone from being invisible in his old school to being known by everyone at Westbrook, not just as the boy who saved Mrs. Hughes, but as someone who belonged there. When he arrived home, his mother was just returning from her first day at her new job. She wore a new business suit and carried a leather briefcase, gifts from the Hughes family. Her eyes sparkled with a confidence he hadn't seen in years. "How was it?" They both asked simultaneously, then laughed. They spent the evening sharing stories about their new experiences, both aware that this was just the beginning. Their small apartment felt different now, not because of the new possessions, but because it was no longer a place of limitation. It was merely a starting point for whatever came next. The weekend dinner at the Hughes mansion felt like stepping into another dimension. Since the fire had damaged the upper floors, they gathered at the family's secondary residence, a sprawling estate on the outskirts of the city. Jaden and his mother arrived in one of Hughes's cars, both dressed in new clothes that still felt foreign on their skin. Alexander greeted them at the door himself, dressed casually in what Jaden recognized as designer clothing that probably cost more than their old monthly rent. The entrance hall gleamed with marble floors and crystal chandeliers, but Alexander's warm smile made it feel less intimidating. "Mrs. Carter, Jaden, welcome," he said, leading them inside. "Victoria has been looking forward to this all week." Mrs. Hughes sat in an elegant armchair in the living room, looking fully recovered. Lucas lounged on a nearby sofa, immediately jumping up when he saw Jaden. The room was larger than their entire apartment, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking manicured gardens. "Jaden," Mrs. Hughes called out. "Come, sit here where I can see you properly. How are you finding Westbrook?" As Jaden described his first week at school, servants moved quietly around them, serving appetizers on silver trays. Regina sat stiffly at first, but Mrs. Hughes's genuine interest in her new job at Hughes Enterprises gradually helped her relax. Alexander told Regina, "The financial department speaks highly of you. Johnson says you've already streamlined several processes." During dinner, served in a dining room that could have hosted 50 people, the conversation flowed naturally. Lucas talked about basketball practice where Jaden had already impressed the coach. Mrs. Hughes asked about Jaden's classes, offering suggestions for additional tutoring if he needed it. "I've been meaning to tell you," Alexander said during the main course. "The fire department's official report came in. The investigators confirmed that without your intervention, Jaden, my mother would not have survived. The smoke detectors failed and the fire spread faster than anyone anticipated." The weight of those words settled over the table. Mrs. Hughes reached over and squeezed Jaden's hand. "I haven't forgotten a moment of it," she said softly. "The smoke, the fear, and then this young voice telling me to hold on." After dinner, while the adults moved to the study for coffee, Lucas showed Jaden their home basketball court, a professional-grade facility complete with shooting machines and electronic scoreboard. "Dad's having one installed at your new place," Lucas mentioned casually. "New place?" Jaden asked. "Oh, was it supposed to be a surprise? Sorry. Dad's arranging a house for you and your mom, closer to school and the office. Nothing too fancy," he said, "since your mom insisted on keeping things reasonable. But definitely better than the apartment." Jaden absorbed this information, thinking about how much had changed in just a week. His mother's new job, his new school, and now potentially a new home. It felt overwhelming, yet somehow right. When they returned to the adults, Alexander was showing Regina some papers. "It's a modest 3-bedroom house," he was saying. "Good neighborhood, excellent school district, though of course Jaden will continue at Westbrook. The commute to the office would be 10 minutes at most." Regina started to protest, but Alexander held up his hand. "Consider it a long-term investment in 2 valuable members of the Hughes Enterprises family. The mortgage payments will be manageable on your new salary, and you'll be building equity instead of paying rent." Mrs. Hughes watched the discussion with satisfaction. She beckoned Jaden over while the others talked details. "You know," she said quietly, "I've lived a long life, seen many people come and go, but I've rarely seen such a perfect example of how one moment of courage can transform multiple lives." She patted his hand. "You're handling it all remarkably well." Before they left, Mrs. Hughes presented Jaden with a small box. Inside was a gold tie pin with the Hughes family crest. "It belonged to my husband," she explained. "He wore it when he signed his first major business deal. I think he'd want you to have it." On the ride home, Jaden and his mother sat in comfortable silence, both processing the evening. Their apartment building looked shabbier than ever in contrast to where they'd been, but Jaden didn't mind. Everything was temporary now, stepping stones to where they were meant to be. "Mom," he said as they climbed the stairs, "are you happy?" Regina stopped, looking at her son with tears in her eyes. "Jaden, watching you become the person you were always meant to be, that's more happiness than I ever dreamed possible." 6 months had passed since the day of the fire. Jaden stood in front of his new bedroom mirror, adjusting his basketball uniform. The Westbrook Academy jersey fit perfectly, and the number 23, his choice, stood out boldly on the back. Today was his first official game as a starting player. Through the window, He could see their new home's backyard, complete with the practice court Alexander had installed. The house was modest by Hughes' standards, but felt like a palace compared to their old apartment. His mother had insisted on making the mortgage payments herself, though Alexander had arranged a very favorable rate. "Jaden," his mother called from downstairs. "The car's here." He grabbed his sports bag and headed down. Their house, while comfortable, wasn't extravagant. 3 bedrooms, a modern kitchen, and a small study where his mother sometimes worked from home. They'd kept some of their old furniture, mixing it with new pieces to create a home that felt both familiar and fresh. The Hughes family car waited outside. These days it felt normal to slide into the leather seats, though Jaden never took it for granted. Lucas was already inside, wearing his matching uniform. "Ready?" Lucas grinned. "Scout from State University is coming to watch today." At Westbrook, Jaden had flourished both academically and athletically. The initial curiosity about the boy who saved Mrs. Hughes had faded, replaced by respect for his skills on the court and his determination in class. His grades had improved dramatically with the help of tutors and smaller class sizes, and several colleges had already expressed interest. They arrived at the school gymnasium to find it packed. Jaden spotted his mother sitting with the Hughes family in the reserved section. Mrs. Hughes attended every home game, always wearing a scarf in Westbrook's colors. She had become something of a grandmother figure to Jaden, regularly inviting him for tea and asking about his future plans. As the team warmed up, Coach Richardson called Jaden aside. "Your three-point shooting has improved tremendously," he said. "Those morning practice sessions with Lucas are paying off. Start strong today. That scout is particularly interested in you." The game was intense from the start. Jaden played with confidence, his movements smooth and practiced. All those hours on his home court, all the professional training the Hughes family had arranged, showed in every play. By halftime, he had scored 20 points and made several crucial assists to Lucas. In the stands, Alexander Hughes watched with satisfaction. He had taken a personal interest in Jaden's development, not just as a student, but as a future business leader. Twice a week, Jaden attended informal mentoring sessions in Alexander's office, learning about business strategy and leadership. Regina sat nearby looking elegant in her business attire. Her recent promotion to department head had come purely on merit. Her innovative approaches to financial management had saved the company millions. The other executives had quickly learned to respect her intelligence and work ethic. During a timeout in the fourth quarter, Jaden caught sight of Mr. Martinez and Mrs. Park in the crowd. They often came to his games now. Their presence reminded him of where he'd come from and how far he'd traveled. Mrs. Park no longer worried about him getting into trouble in wealthy neighborhoods. Instead, she bragged to everyone about her neighborhood boy, who had made good. Westbrook won the game, with Jaden scoring the final basket. As the crowd cheered, he felt a profound sense of belonging. This was his world now, not because of luck or charity, but because he'd earned it through one brave action and months of hard work afterward. After the game, the college scout spoke with both Jaden and his mother. The conversation was promising, hinting at possible scholarships. But education wasn't a concern anymore. The trust fund Mrs. Hughes had established would cover any university Jaden chose to attend. That evening, celebrating at the Hughes residence, Jaden found a quiet moment with Mrs. Hughes in her favorite sitting room. "I never properly thanked you," he said softly. "For what, dear?" "For everything. The trust fund, the opportunities, believing in me." Mrs. Hughes smiled, touching the familiar burn scar on his arm. "Jaden, you thanked me the moment you climbed through that window. Everything since then has simply been the world recognizing what I saw in those terrifying moments. A young man of extraordinary character." Looking around at his extended family, his mother chatting confidently with Alexander about business strategy, Lucas arguing playfully with his father about game statistics, Mrs. Hughes watching it all with contentment, Jaden felt complete. One moment of courage had not just changed his life. It had shown him who he truly was, and who he could become. The fire had destroyed part of the old Hughes mansion. But from those ashes, something more valuable had risen. A bridge between two worlds and the proof that courage knows no boundaries of class or color. 1 year after the fire, Jaden stood in the rebuilt Hughes mansion surrounded by cameras and reporters. The story of his rescue had caught national attention, and a major news network was filming a special segment about how one act of courage had transformed multiple lives. Mrs. Hughes sat regally in her restored study, the room where Jaden had found her that fateful day. The walls still held the same books, though now a framed newspaper article about the rescue hung prominently above the fireplace. Next to it was a photo of Jaden in his Westbrook graduation robes taken just last week. "Tell us about that moment," the reporter asked, adjusting her microphone. "What made you decide to climb that gate when everyone else stayed back?" Jaden glanced at Mrs. Hughes before answering. "I didn't think about the consequences or differences. I just heard someone who needed help. Everything else, race, class, wealth, none of that mattered in that moment." The camera panned to show Regina, now a senior financial executive at Hughes Enterprises, dressed in a designer suit that she wore with natural confidence. The reporter noted how both mother and son had risen to prominence in their respective fields. "Mrs. Carter," the reporter asked, "did you ever imagine your son's act of bravery would lead to such dramatic changes in your lives?" Regina smiled, her eyes meeting Alexander's across the room. "The real change wasn't in our circumstances," she said. "It was in how the world finally saw who my son truly was, who we both were, when given the opportunity to show it." Lucas, home from his first year of college where Jaden would join him in the fall, stood nearby with his father. The two boys had become inseparable friends, their bond transcending their different backgrounds. They had led Westbrook's basketball team to a state championship, and both had earned sports scholarships to the same university. Alexander Hughes stepped forward to add his perspective. "What Jaden did that day reminded us all that character isn't determined by zip code or bank balance. When he ran into this house, he wasn't thinking about what he might gain. He was thinking about what someone else might lose." The cameras followed as they walked through the restored mansion. The trellis Jaden had climbed was now replaced with a stronger structure, though Mrs. Hughes had insisted on keeping it rather than installing modern security stairs. "It's a reminder," she explained to the reporter, "that sometimes the most direct path to doing right isn't the conventional one." They paused in the garden, where a small plaque commemorated the event. Mrs. Hughes had established a foundation in Jaden's name, providing scholarships to underprivileged students who demonstrated exceptional character. The first round of recipients would be announced next month. "Looking back," the reporter asked Jaden, "what would you say to other young people who might feel limited by their circumstances?" Jaden thought about his old apartment, about Mr. Martinez and Mrs. Park, who still waved to him whenever he visited the old neighborhood. He thought about the kids who now played basketball on the community court he'd helped build there, funded by the Hughes Foundation. "I'd tell them that courage doesn't wait for perfect conditions," he said. "Sometimes you have to climb the gate in front of you. Even when people tell you to stay back, you might be surprised who's waiting to help you up on the other side." After the cameras stopped rolling, the families gathered in the dining room, no longer as benefactor and beneficiary, but as people bound by something deeper than circumstance. Mrs. Hughes raised her glass in a toast. "To have courage," she said, "which knows no boundaries. And to family," Alexander added, "which can be found in the most unexpected moments." Jaden looked around the table, at his mother's proud smile, at Lucas's brotherly grin, at Mrs. Hughes's grandmotherly affection, at Alexander's mentorly pride. The room that had once been filled with smoke and fear now overflowed with love and possibility. Later that evening, as they prepared to leave, Mrs. Hughes pulled Jaden aside. She pressed something into his hand, the key to the house. "You're always welcome here," she said softly. "Not because of what you did that day, but because of who you've shown yourself to be every day since." 5 years after the fire, Jaden stood at a podium in the Westbrook Academy Gymnasium, addressing a new generation of students. Now a college graduate with honors and a rising executive at Hughes Enterprises, He had returned to share his story at the school's annual Inspiration Assembly. "When I first walked through these halls, he began, I was an outsider who had done one brave thing. Today, I want to talk about what happened after that moment, how one act of courage became a lifetime of possibilities." The audience included his mother Regina, now CFO of Hughes Enterprises Eastern Division, and Mrs. Hughes, elegant as ever at 82. Alexander sat with the board of trustees, while Lucas, who had just started his own tech company with his father's backing, filmed the speech on his phone. "People often ask me about the fire," Jaden continued, "about what made me climb that gate. But the real story isn't about the climbing. It's about what happens when someone believes in you enough to help you stay up once you've made it over." He gestured to the Hughes family, then to his mother. True transformation isn't just about changing circumstances. It's about recognizing potential in unexpected places. It's about breaking down the barriers we build between communities, between people who think they're too different to connect. In the years since the rescue, the Hughes Foundation's scholarship program had helped hundreds of students from underprivileged backgrounds attend Westbrook. Many of them sat in the audience today, wearing the same uniform Jaden had once found so foreign. "Success isn't just about seizing one moment," he told them. "It's about what you do with every moment that follows. It's about honoring the faith people place in you by becoming someone worthy of that faith." After the assembly, they gathered at the Hughes mansion, now a second home to Jaden and his mother. The study where he had found Mrs. Hughes that day had become a favorite spot for their weekly discussions about life, business, and the future. "Did I ever tell you," Mrs. Hughes said as they sat in their usual chairs, "that the fire was the best thing that ever happened to our family?" Jaden looked surprised. "Even with all you lost?" "We lost things, dear." She smiled, touching his hand. "But we gained a family. Sometimes it takes a moment of crisis to show us what's truly valuable." Alexander joined them, carrying a folder. "Speaking of value," he said, "the board approved your proposal for the new community development project. They were particularly impressed with how you integrated educational opportunities with business development." The project was Jaden's brainchild, a comprehensive plan to revitalize his old neighborhood without displacing its residents. It would include affordable housing, educational resources, and business incubators, all supported by Hughes Enterprises. "Your father would be proud," Regina said softly from the doorway. "He always said you would change the world someday." Looking around at his expanded family, the mother who had never lost faith in him, the woman he had saved who had become a grandmother to him, the man who had seen his potential and helped him realize it, the friend who had become a brother, Jaden felt the weight of their shared journey. The mansion's restored walls held memories of both tragedy and triumph. The trellis outside stood as a monument not just to one brave climb, but to all the steps that had followed, each one leading higher, each one proving that courage comes in many forms. "We all have fires to face," Jaden had told the students earlier. "Sometimes they're literal flames, and sometimes they're the barriers we think we can't overcome. But there's always a way up and over, if we're brave enough to try, and kind enough to help others make the same climb." As the evening sun cast long shadows through the study windows, Jaden realized that the real story hadn't been about saving Mrs. Hughes from the fire. It had been about how that one moment had ignited a chain reaction of transformation, proving that courage, compassion, and opportunity could bridge any divide. The young boy who had once looked up at a burning mansion, wondering if he dared to climb its walls, had become a man who built bridges between worlds, and in doing so he had shown that the greatest acts of courage often come not in dramatic moments of rescue, but in the quiet, daily choice to keep reaching higher, to keep helping others up, to keep believing that barriers are meant to be overcome. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.